If you took a Mauser round to the abdomen in the Ardennes in 1944, or caught a piece of shrapnel from a mortar burst on the frozen approach to the Chaussin Reservoir in 1950, your statistical likelihood of survival was a grim calculus dictated almost entirely by geography. You were at the mercy of the stretcher bearers, the mud, the frozen roads, and the agonizingly slow travel time to a battalion aid station. In World War II, nearly 30% of soldiers who reached a medical facility still died of their wounds. By the time the United States was fully embroiled in the jungles of Southeast Asia, that number had plummeted to less than 3%. This statistical anomaly was not the result of a miracle drug or a sudden evolution in human physiology. It was the result of a turbine engine, a rotor blade, and a doctrine written in blood by men who flew unarmed aluminum shells into the mouth of hell. We call it the golden hour, the critical 60-minute window where immediate surgical intervention can reverse the tide of shock and trauma. But for the men of the 57th Medical Detachment, it was simply known as Dustoff. Before we analyze the mechanics of this logistical revolution, if you are interested in the granular history of military aviation and the men who pushed these machines past their breaking points, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video, as it helps us continue to dig through the archives to bring you these stories. To understand why the Vietnam mortality rate dropped so precipitously, we must first look at the machine that made it possible. The icon of this conflict is, inevitably, the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, colloquially known as the Huey. Specifically, for the medical evacuation role, we are often looking at the UH-1D model. This was not a robust tank of the air. It was a triumph of utility over survivability. Powered by a single Lycoming T53 L11 turboshaft engine, it generated 1,100 shaft horsepower, which sounds substantial until you account for the density altitude of the Vietnamese highlands and a cabin loaded with terrified wounded men. The airframe itself was a semi-monocoque construction of aluminum alloy, magnesium, and honeycomb panels. It was lightweight, yes, but against small arms fire, it offered about as much protection as a wet newspaper. The fuel cells were technically self-sealing, and the transmission had a chip detector to warn of disintegrating gears, but the reality was that a single well-placed 7.62 round through the hydraulic servo or the tail rotor drive shaft would turn this aerodynamic marvel into a falling brick. The genius of the Huey, however, lay in its sliding cargo doors and its low-skid landing gear. Unlike the primitive Sikorsky bubble canopy helicopters of the Korean War, which required wounded men to be strapped into external pods, exposed to the freezing slipstream, the Huey could swallow litters whole. The cabin could accommodate up to 6 stretchers if arranged in a specific tiered configuration, or more often, a chaotic pile of walking wounded. But the engineering capabilities of the Bell helicopter were irrelevant without a fundamental shift in how the Army viewed the extraction of casualties. In the early 1960s, the prevailing wisdom was that helicopters were too valuable to risk for a single wounded soldier, and certainly too fragile to land in a hot landing zone while the enemy was still firing. This bureaucratic caution was the standard operating procedure until it collided with the personality of Major Charles Kelly. Kelly was not a young hotshot. He was a 43-year-old veteran of the Second World War who had seen combat from the ground. He took command of the 57th Medical Detachment in 1964, a time when the unit was suffering from low morale, poor maintenance, and a lack of clear direction. The call sign, Dustoff, was chosen largely at random. a specific reference to the dry season kicking up clouds of red earth. But Kelly turned it into a proper noun that commanded immediate reverence on the radio net. His philosophy was technically insubordinate, but morally unassailable. If a soldier was wounded, the helicopter flew. Period. Weather, enemy fire, and maintenance schedules were secondary considerations. He famously told his pilots that if they refused a mission, they would answer to him, and he was far more terrifying than the Viet Cong. This aggressive posture created immediate friction with the ground commanders and the aviation safety officers who viewed Kelly's tactics as reckless. The standard procedure for a medevac request involved a tedious chain of command, verifying the security of the landing zone, or LZ, and waiting for gunship escorts. Kelly bypassed this. He began flying into unsecured zones, often hovering at treetop level to hoist wounded men out of triple-canopy jungle while taking fire. He understood something. The brass did not. The psychology of the infantryman. Knowing that a Dustoff bird would come for you, no matter what, was a force multiplier more potent than artillery support. It allowed men to fight with the assurance that they would not be left to bleed out in the mud. However, this dedication to the mission was placing an unsustainable strain on both the airframes and the pilots, and a confrontation with destiny was becoming mathematically inevitable. The defining moment for the Dustoff legacy occurred on July 1st, 1964, in Vinh Long Province. Kelly was responding to a request to extract wounded soldiers from a fierce firefight. As he approached the LZ, the enemy fire was withering. Small arms, heavy machine guns, and mortars were bracketing the landing site. The American advisor on the ground, fearing the loss of the aircraft, radioed Kelly to wave him off, screaming, "Get out! The LZ is too hot!" Kelly, manipulating the cyclic and collective with the calm precision of a man parking a car, keyed his microphone and delivered the line that would become the epitaph and the motto of the entire Corps. He said simply, "When I have your wounded." Moments later, a bullet entered the open cockpit window, piercing his heart. The Huey shuddered, nosed over, and crashed. Major Charles Kelly was dead, but in dying, he had won the argument. The shock of Kelly's death did not result in a clampdown on safety regulations as one might expect from a peacetime bureaucracy. Instead, it galvanized the medical corps. The Army realized that Kelly's aggressive method was the only way to validate the golden hour concept. If they reverted to the old, safe ways, the survival rates would plummet. So, the Kelly Doctrine became standard practice. Dustoff pilots were authorized to launch immediately, often without gunship cover, and often into active engagement zones. The technical challenges of this flying were immense. We must consider the pilot's workload. The UH-1 is not a stable platform. It requires constant inputs. In a hover, the pilot is fighting the torque of the main rotor with the tail rotor pedals, managing altitude with the collective pitch lever in his left hand, and controlling position with the cyclic stick in his right hand. Doing this in broad daylight is difficult. Doing it at night, under fire, while looking for a flashlight beam in a dense jungle, is a feat of airmanship that borders on the impossible. Night operations were particularly harrowing. The instrument lighting in early model Hueys was often rudimentary, and the glare from tracers or flares could easily induce spatial disorientation, or the leans, where a pilot's inner ear disagrees with his instruments about which way is up. To combat this, Dustoff crews developed the reverse overhead approach. Instead of a long, shallow glide slope that exposed the aircraft to ground fire for an extended period, the pilot would approach the LZ at high altitude, directly overhead. Then he would drop the collective, dump the lift, and enter a tight, spiraling auto-rotation, essentially a controlled crash, stopping the descent just above the trees with a massive flare of the rotor blades. This maneuver minimized the time the helicopter was a target and kept it inside the dead cone above the enemy's heavy guns. It required nerves of steel and a profound trust in the structural integrity of the rotor mast, which was being subjected to G-forces far beyond the manufacturer's recommended limits. While the pilots wrestled with the physics of flight, the drama in the rear cabin was of a different nature entirely. The medic, or corpsman, was the unsung hero of the Dustoff crew. Working in a vibrating, deafeningly loud aluminum box, often slipping on a floor, slick with blood and hydraulic fluid, the medic had to perform triage and advanced trauma care. We are talking about inserting IVs, applying tourniquets, and sealing sucking chest wounds in pitch darkness, illuminated only by the intermittent flash of muzzle fire or a red lens, flashlight held in the teeth. The space was cramped. A loaded Huey might have 4 litter patients and 3 walking wounded crammed in, plus the door gunners, if they carried them. This brings us to a contentious point of doctrine: the Red Cross. Technically, under the Geneva Convention, medical aircraft are non-combatants and should be marked with a large red cross on a white background. They are not supposed to carry offensive weaponry. For the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, however, the Red Cross was merely an aiming point. It was high visibility white on a dark olive drab background, essentially a bullseye. While some Dustoff crews eventually mounted M60 machine guns for self-defense, many adhered to the unarmed mandate, relying on speed and the chaotic geometry of the battlefield to survive. This meant flying into an ambush with no way to shoot back, relying entirely on the suppressive fire of the infantry they were saving, or the accompanying slick gunships, if they were lucky enough to have them. The mechanical attrition was staggering. The engines ingested dust, sand, and foliage. The compressor blades of the T-53 engine would erode, losing efficiency and power just when it was needed most to pull out of a heavy hover. The honeycombed aluminum tail booms were magnets for shrapnel. A common failure point was the tail rotor control cables. If these were severed, the helicopter would spin uncontrollably. Pilots were trained to enter a run-on landing if they lost tail rotor authority, keeping the forward speed up to streamline the fuselage. But in a jungle clearing the size of a tennis court, this was rarely an option. The result was often a hard spin and a crash. Yet the crews climbed into fresh airframes and went back out. The turnover rate of airframes was high. The turnover rate of crews was tragic. 1/3 of all Dustoff crew members were killed or wounded. Let's look at the specifics of the hoist mission, perhaps the most technically demanding evolution of all. When the jungle canopy was too thick to land, which was true for much of the Central Highlands, the crew had to use a cable hoist to lower a jungle penetrator or a Stokes litter to the ground. The pilot had to hold a perfect hover at perhaps 100 feet. Without a visual reference point on the ground, which was often obscured by trees, the pilot relied on the crew chief leaning out the door, giving verbal corrections over the intercom. Left 3, forward 2, hold, steady. This could go on for 20 minutes. During this time, the helicopter was a stationary target, a loud, vibrating piñata for any enemy soldier with an AK-47. The medic often rode the hoist down, exposing himself to direct fire to strap the wounded man in. There are documented accounts of hoists being shot through, dropping patients back to the ground, or medics shielding the patient with their own bodies as they were winched up through the leaves. The logistical backbone required to keep these birds flying was equally impressive. The maintenance crews worked 24-hour shifts, swapping engines and patching bullet holes with sheet metal and rivets. The tolerances on a helicopter are not like those on a Jeep. A vibration of a fraction of an inch in the main rotor track can tear the transmission out of its mounts. These mechanics, often working in open revetments under monsoon rains, performed miracles of field engineering. They knew that if a cotter pin was missed or a safety wire was loose, the men in the air and the men bleeding on the ground would pay the price. By the late 1960s, the system had been refined into a high-speed assembly line of survival. A call would come in. Dustoff! Dustoff! This is Highlander 6, urgent surgical, grid coordinates. Within 2 minutes, the bird was cranking. The turbine would whine to life. The igniters would pop, and the rotors would begin their slow, lethargic turn before blurring into a disk. The pilot would check his gauges, exhaust gas temperature, transmission pressure, torque, and lift into the humid air. They would navigate by map and compass, and by the sheer instinct developed over hundreds of hours of flight time. They flew through monsoons where visibility was zero, flying solely on instruments, trusting the artificial horizon while the rain hammered the plexiglass like machine gun fire. The legacy of these crews is quantified in the lives of the men they saved. The survival rate of 97.4% for those who reached a medical facility is a statistic without parallel in the history of warfare up to that point. It changed the expectation of the American soldier. In previous wars, a wound often meant a slow, agonizing wait for death or a permanent disability. In Vietnam, a soldier knew that if he could just stay alive for 20 minutes, the whop-whop of that blade slap would signal his salvation. It created a bond between the infantry and the aviators that is difficult to overstate. The sight of a Dustoff bird nosing over into a hot LZ, ignoring the green tracers arching up to meet it, remains one of the most enduring and emotional images of the war. As the war drew to a close and the withdrawal began, the Dustoff crews were among the last to leave. They continued to fly support for the ARVN and the remaining advisors. The tactics and procedures they developed, the scoop and run philosophy, the en route trauma care, the rapid coordination between ground and air, formed the blueprint for modern civilian air ambulance services. If you have ever seen a life flight helicopter land on a highway to pick up a crash victim, you are looking at the direct lineage of Charles Kelly and the 57th Medical Detachment. The technology has improved. The engines are more powerful. The avionics are digital, and the airframes are composite. But the core principle remains the same: a refusal to accept the logistical constraints of death. In the final analysis, the story of Dustoff is not about the helicopter, despite its engineering marvels. It is about the suppression of the survival instinct for the benefit of another. It is about the pilot who holds a hover while his windshield disintegrates simply because there is a kid from Iowa bleeding out on the jungle floor below him. It is a testament to the cold, hard competence of men who treated heroism as a standard operating procedure. I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Specifically, If you have any knowledge of the specific modifications made to the UH-1H model compared to the D model regarding the engine upgrades for high-altitude performance, let's get a discussion going. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the logistics and valor of the Dustoff cruise, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next analysis of military history's most critical machines and moments.